Welcome to POTUS 2017, where we keep watch on the Oval Office and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Today, a special program. We've gathered some political specialists and general practitioners to examine the administration's effect so far on the country and on the presidency itself. Even without passing a major piece of legislation, it's safe to say that the effect has been profound. Let's get right to our panel. First, via Skype from Los Angeles at the Paramount Studios, I'm told, Frank Rich, the executive producer of the HBO series Veep, where fiction may be funnier than truth, but these days not always stranger. Frank is also writer-at-large for New York Magazine. And here in our New York studio, three guests: Oren Cass, senior fellow with Manhattan Institute, the conservative think tank, where he focuses on anti-poverty policy, energy, and the environment. Oren was domestic policy advisor to Mitt Romney during his 2012 presidential run. Kathryn Kolbert directs the Athena Center at Barnard College. She's a distinguished lawyer who has defended Planned Parenthood at the Supreme Court and is the former president of the progressive advocacy organization People for the American Way. And thank goodness, Greg David is here. Greg often translates economics into English for us on this show. A columnist for Crain's New York Business and prolific blogger, Greg directs the Business and Economics reporting program at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. Welcome, all of you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Frank, I presume you're not taking the Paramount Studios tour.
No, we're here trying to dream up a new season of Veep, even as everyone's looking at their phones to see what in God's name is going on in the farce in Washington, the real-life farce.
Well, how do you make fiction that holds up as more compelling narrative than anything you can see on CNN at any given moment?
It's a challenge. I mean, one thing that we have going for us, I hope, is that we never reference contemporary politicians. We've never had a Trump joke or a Hillary joke or Obama joke. We have an alternative reality that we sort of try to escape into. But, you know, our characters are craven, narcissistic, don't care about anything but power, could care less about their constituents. So it's a world that is somewhat comparable to what's going on now, but we try to be funny about it. And, you know, we're just starting work on our 7th season, so we'll see.
Kathryn, how is democracy itself holding up?
Well, I wish it was better. I think in the big picture, the unrelenting attacks on the free press, I think, are extraordinary and very, very problematic in the long term.
But one could argue that anybody can criticize the press. That's part of freedom of speech in the First Amendment, and the press is standing up for itself quite strongly, thank you. Would you push back on that?
Well, yes, but not enough, because the reality is that in the eyes of a great number of Americans, the attacks on the press have hit home. They begin to question what is truth and what is alternative truth. And the fact that we no longer have a discussion in America around truth is very, very problematic in the big picture. The second place I think we're seeing incredible problems is the kind of this notion that our country is governed by the rule of law. And the attacks on the rule of law, the fact that the president thinks he's immune from that, is a very, very problematic long-term development that I think erodes our democracy.
Oren, we knew that Donald Trump said nice things in the campaign about Vladimir Putin and other people considered strongman leaders in other countries, and that's one of the things that led to the rise of concern about authoritarianism here if he got elected. How's democracy holding up according to you?
It seems to be doing pretty well. I mean, I think the system is working the way it's supposed to. I would agree with every criticism of what the president is doing that's inappropriate and potentially destructive and undermining of norms in the long run. But there's nothing in the Constitution that says the president can't be a lousy person. You know, actually Hamilton writes a lot in the Federalist Papers about the concerns with the president being a lousy person. A lot of the point of our constitutional system is to be prepared for the president to be a lousy person. And certainly to this point, I think both the press and civil society and the other branches, even a Congress that is Republican but holding an awful lot of Russia hearings, is maybe not proceeding as fast as some people would want, but doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Frank Rich, didn't you write a book called The Death of Truth or something like that?
The greatest story ever sold. It was about the run-up to the Iraq War and the propaganda campaign of primarily the Bush administration to put it over to the susceptible public and Democrats. And look, we've had a truthiness, to use Stephen Colbert's word, problem for some time. And the fact is, some people in this country want to believe whatever they want to believe. So this morning, I think Morning Consult had a poll that most Trump supporters believed that he won the popular vote. So the press, to get back to the point about the press, there's a certain place in which we're impotent, where the legitimate press is, quote, fake news, and have to, press on, but let's not delude ourselves that we can reach Trump's base, because we can't.
We should ask another question. What is the state of democracy? What is the state of those of us who live in the democracy? I interviewed Robert De Niro a couple weeks ago, and he told me that he thought that it was physically and mentally affecting people in a very bad way. And when the new season of House of Cards started running, the woman I live with and I started to watch it.
That's Brand X, according to Frank. Go ahead.
And after an episode, I turned to her and said, I can't watch a show about an evil president anymore.
So, go ahead, Frank.
I would just say the cultural impact of this presidency is indeed not to be underestimated. I get what De Niro is talking about, because the fact is, the one thing we can say about Trump, whatever else we think of him, he is something of a master manipulator of entertainment, and he constantly provides new plot developments. Witnessed this morning, the transgender ban, and so it keeps everybody on edge, and it makes it very hard to, if you care at all about civic life, it's a constant thing. It's exhausting. I think a lot of people I know just feel that exhaustion, whatever they think of his policies or non-policies.
Yeah. Kathryn, before we move on to other things, one other thing about how democracy is holding up for you as a lawyer. The president's complaints about Jeff Sessions seem to be that Sessions, by recusing himself, wasn't doing his duty to the president who appointed him to be the defender of the president against an investigation into the president. That's not what I think the Attorney General of the United States' role is supposed to be, as opposed to the upholder of the rule of law.
That's right. And I think that's kind of indicative of the administration all the way down the line. That is, that the institutions of justice, whatever they be, whether they be the FBI or the Justice Department, are meant to, in Trump's view, meant to serve the presidency as opposed to serving the rule of law. And that in many respects, with the discussion of pardons and everything else, that the presidency is immune from just standard notions of fairness, notions of not having conflicts of interest, notions of following the disclosure rules, releasing their tax returns, whatever it may be. There's just an impunity against the rules that have governed the presidency by custom in the past 50 years.
Frank mentioned the ban on transgender Americans in the American military announced by the president. Did that come out of the blue for you? Did you see that coming? This is a president who campaigned on Caitlyn Jenner being able to go to any bathroom in Trump Tower and things like that.
Well, I think what we can only say is that it didn't surprise me. It's consistent with the right that has been pushing the agenda coming out of the White House in many respects. But I do think this was just one way to create another distraction. That is, between healthcare and Russia this week, having a way to change the conversation is quite useful for the president, and that's what I think is happening.
Oren, it's not your specialty area, but what do you think of that?
Well, I think already we've seen Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the spokesperson, come out and say, well, we don't actually know what this means or how we're going to implement it.
Nice that the communications office under the new communications director is talking to the president.
Look, who knows how many presidents in the past would have used Twitter as poorly as this one does. My guess is none. but it is funny to think that if he didn't have Twitter and had to actually work through standard processes to put out these ideas, you suspect a lot of them would never see the light of day.
I don't know about that. I think he'd call the reporters up. You know, the thing that strikes me is, because he is like someone in my family, he doesn't ever think about the consequences. And I mean the consequences tomorrow. Everything is about the imminency of today. I'm going to wake up at whatever time it is, 3, 4, 5 in the morning, and I'm going to grab the agenda, or I'm going to lash out any way I can without saying, so after I do this, what happens next? It's incredible.
But Frank, do you agree with that? Because some people say this is actually the Steve Bannon playbook. Keep saying the most polarizing possible things. You'll get the media all upset. That'll control the narrative. And the people who will be most energized are the nationalist base.
I think that's part of it. I think all of this is true to some extent. I don't believe it would be any different if Twitter had been invented. I don't think it's about the technology. I think he'd find another way to do this. I do think that, yes, he wants to distract. He wants to distract this week from the apparent failure of any kind of coherent health care bill. He wants to rouse the base and give them the red meat, the Bannon red meat, if you will. But most of all, this is about himself. And if there's a single policy imperative of this president besides holding on to power, it is to sideline and destroy the Russian investigation and any related obstruction of justice investigations. That's what he cares about most. Everything should be now read through that lens, including the Jeff Sessions drama, obviously.
We mentioned Sarah Huckabee Sanders a minute ago. Greg, the press secretary, Sanders said recently, the people care about immigration, jobs, and health care. The media care about Russia, Russia, and Russia. So let's take Trump by his own criteria. On jobs, which, you know, the economy is your area, he promised that trade and immigration changes and removing regulation would lead to a boon in good-paying jobs. How much of it, if at all, are we seeing it in a measurable way?
The question is, does he deserve any credit for what we are seeing? We have a strong economy. He inherited a strong economy. It continues to be strong. In part, we have a strong economy because confidence has soared since his election, especially business confidence, who believes that the policy changes he will put into place will be great for them, both big businesses and to an extraordinary degree small businesses. We've seen a surge in consumer confidence, though frankly, most of it is among Republicans, not so much about Democrats. The economy has continued to perform well, more than 200,000 jobs a month. The stock market is up 14% since Election Day in what is clearly a Trump boom related to the same points that the investors believe there's going to be tax reform and regulatory changes, which will be great.
Because the stock market predicts the future rather than reflects the present?
Predicts their expectations for the future.
So
the economy is doing great, but he inherited a good economy. On the specifics of what he said, he's done nothing. I mean, maybe it's good he hasn't precipitated a trade war, but he hasn't precipitated a trade war yet. Now, steel tariffs could come next week and change that. American companies are making announcements that they are creating new jobs in America, especially manufacturing jobs. He announced or said that Apple's going to open 3 plants. Apple didn't say they would, but we know Foxconn is looking for a place to put an iPhone plant in the country. Many of those announcements were in the works anyway, but some of them are because, well, you know, businesses are not in the habit of antagonizing the president. But are we seeing a surge of good-paying, especially manufacturing jobs, because of the policies Trump has instituted? No.
Any different take on that, Oren?
Well, I think the basic point is right, that he hasn't done anything. So to have a cause and effect, you would have to have the cause, which in general you don't. I think the one place where you have seen a difference in his administration has been on the regulatory front, partly just no new regulations, whereas under Obama or under a Clinton administration you probably would have. But then particularly under EPA, some pretty aggressive action to at least try to start the process of rolling some things back. And so that could be a contributor to confidence. That can also be a direct basis for making investments look more attractive.
What about the regulations? I've seen a pro-Trump article in the last few days that said he's not only slowing the growth of new regulations, he's rolling back lots and lots of regulations, and that this is really good, especially for small business. Is it real?
Well, it's certainly true with respect to EPA and what's called the Congressional Review Act, where they're actually, through Congress, trying to claw back some of what the Obama administration did in its last 6 months or so. And so if you start to talk about kind of the costliest Obama initiatives or most potentially invasive ones that people were upset about, things like the Clean Power Plan, focusing on the utility sector, things like the called the Waters of the United States rule, focused on regulating very small bodies of water. You know, if you're trying to decide how much is Washington going to be involved in what I'm trying to do, the answer is less than before.
Frank, I know you have to go in a minute, then we'll stay for the rest of the time with the other guests. I think you predicted that Trump isn't going to make it through 4 years. Are you standing by that?
Yeah, I think one way or another this is going to implode. And just, talk about the economy a second, just to continue that conversation. We don't know. There could be tariffs. There could be a trade war. The fact is, this president has not faced any crisis yet. He has not faced an economic crisis or a real domestic crisis or a foreign crisis. So we haven't even seen him under pressure. I think one way or another, this just can't sustain itself. And, yes, business may feel confident about what's going to happen in terms of so-called tax reform. I think they're soon going to find that nothing is going to get through Congress that meets their expectations, if anything gets through at all. So I feel we're going to see this come to a head by the time we get to the 2018 midterms.
You wrote that it's not going to be like one person or one thing that gets him out. It's going to be more like a firing squad. That would have to be of the Republican Congress, and Congress has never impeached a president of its own party.
There's no way the Republican Congress is going to impeach a Republican president. That's not going to happen. What's more likely to happen is in the 60 to 80 House districts that are most people like Nate Silver feel will be in play in 2018, there's going to be a stampede to the exits if this administration continues on the path it is. There's no reason. If anything, it's doubling down and getting worse. And I think what will happen, the best case scenario for Trump is a paralyzed situation where he really can't do he can even do less in Congress, but also he's a kind of I'll take my marbles and go home kind of guy if the going gets tough. He's never suffered real adversity.
Frank Rich, I know you got to go. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Our other guests are still with us.
I would ask the question, do you think Trump is enjoying it? Do you think he's enjoying being president?
He doesn't look like he's
and
enjoying it.
And I don't think so either. And that's why I agree with Frank that at some point he will quit.
But people have said this since he got into the race, that he was going to lose some primaries and then he was going to quit because he didn't need it. He's gotten this far.
I don't think he's going to quit. Only because all he has to do is go out and give a speech to his base, and he's, the adulation is enough to keep him going for another day.
And he hasn't lost any support, really.
Right.
He hasn't gained any,
well, he's
but he hasn't lost
slowly losing support, but it's very minor compared to his base.
He is losing support, and I think the other question more likely than quitting is whether he actually runs for re-election. Choosing to kind of drop the mic, as they say, after his undefeated streak at least looks a little bit like going out on top. I think that's more plausible than quitting midterm, certainly.
And then to pick up on what Frank says, and that is the, let's say, medium-term risk here. If healthcare doesn't work, if when the Republicans turn to tax reform, it becomes mired, if the budget becomes mired, and it's presumably dead on arrival, the stock market can crack. At some point, I believe the stock market is going to crack. The economy could falter, all of which will, in quick measure, change a lot of the discussion.
Kathryn, as the lawyer here who has argued before the Supreme Court, how much does the appointment of Gorsuch matter, or how much is it mattering already?
Well, it's a key appointment, but the most significant appointment for at least the social justice issues is the next one. So the entire game is not just getting the Democrats in control of the House for impeachment purposes, but controlling the Senate for purposes of a next Supreme Court appointment. And there's just every likelihood that one of the justices will step down in the next 3 years or 2.5 years. It's inevitable. And having control of the Senate by the Democrats is the only thing that will stop a change in the law for the next 20 years. And that, I don't think we've made that clear enough. Like, Gorsuch was important, but really it's the next seat that's the key.
Has he mattered to anything already in this round of decisions that came out in June?
Not yet, but he's tipped his hand as to how he interprets the Constitution and the kind of the Scalia-like approach, looking very carefully at the language of the Constitution is key to him, although I think he has at least acknowledged that it's never as clear as you think it's going to be when you're a bystander as opposed to actually being.
And staying with you for a minute as the constitutional lawyer, how much do you, is there a likely scenario that you see of the Russia investigation coming to a constitutional crisis, either in the president trying to pardon himself or some such thing, or anything else?
I think it just depends on how much, where Trump goes with this. If he fires Sessions, if he tries to go after Mueller, if he continues to interfere with the investigation, then I think that does become a crisis at some point. But it hasn't played out to that point yet, and I think we just need to see. The pardon question, I think is hyperbole. It's clear to me, given the structure of the Constitution, that he can't pardon himself. And frankly, the politics are such that he's not going to want to do that. But he could pardon the underlings in the investigation, and that's a big problem because then Mueller has fewer people to testify in any particular investigation.
But it could be soon. I mean, there's speculation that this barrage against Sessions is designed to set the stage for him being fired when the Congress goes on recess, right, so he can appoint a Rudy Giuliani in August to undertake these actions. So, yes, I mean, we're all waiting and we don't know what Mueller's got or what he's going to get. But it theoretically could be around the corner.
Yes, but I don't think the Democrats are going to let the Senate go out of session, so that the recess appointment is going to be harder than.
Oren, you support a lot of the Trump administration energy policy. Do you see it having an effect either environmentally? I know you're a critic of the Paris Accord, or in terms of energy supply and availability.
Well, I think it certainly could in a couple of respects. I think it is already starting to create the basis for opening up more investment in oil and gas development. And so part of the question is just versus before, and the other is versus if you'd had a Clinton administration. I think you're certainly seeing the U.S. on a higher trajectory of fossil fuel development than you would have under a different administration. And then the flip side is what's going to happen to renewable energy. There are a lot of subsidies that potentially are going to phase out. I think conversely, though, you've seen even Republicans in Congress be still very supportive of investment in research and development. So, for instance, there's a program called ARPA-E, which is where we do a lot of our investment in way out there technologies. On the energy front, the Trump administration tried to slash that budget, and Republicans have said, no, the next energy bill is going to have that in there. So I think that's a place where the things on the regulatory side that the White House control, they're moving in actually a good direction. Bigger picture legislative things, Congress is actually checking them on a little bit.
Greg, I think you've noted that in New York, you cover local politics in New York as well as national politics and the economy, that tax revenues at the state level are down. And I think that's true in some other states as well.
Too.
Even though the economy seems to be booming and the stock market is booming. Does that have anything to do with the Trump administration?
Everything to do with it. We think everything to do with the Trump administration. Look, in states with very progressive income taxes, the money comes from the top 10%, sometimes even the top 1%. They don't get wages like we do. They get all their money from capital gains and dividends. Well, Trump is promising a major tax cut for them. So they are delaying taking capital gains sales. This has happened many times before. Whenever a major tax bill is pending, people change their behavior, because if they're not going to pay 30%, but they're going to pay 15%, this is real dollars. So California's income tax revenues are down. New York fell by $365 million in the quarter. We're $1 billion behind last year. In the long run, it's going to even off, but the next year is going to be choppy for states while investors decide what's the likelihood of this tax bill passing or not.
Kathryn, is Planned Parenthood going to survive the Trump administration?
I think that there's some serious problems. They've already gone after Title X, which is the largest federal provider of family planning services. That affects Planned Parenthood, but it affects a variety of other providers as well. The budget has restrictions on Planned Parenthood funding. I mean, the reality is this is the worst time for family planning, for contraception, that we've seen in terms of the attacks at the state level, the attacks at the federal level in the last 25 years.
They say they want to move Planned Parenthood funding to other women's health providers. Is that not doable?
It's not doable. They're the largest provider of women's health services in the nation, and internationally as well. They incredibly large institution, and frankly, incredibly respected institution by women who seek their services.
But how much of their funding comes from the federal government?
Oh, huge amounts. Huge amounts. I don't know the exact number, but it's going to be more than half, because all of the direct service, which is mostly family planning, contraceptive access, not abortion. Abortion's very small, comes from federal Title X.
And we're almost out of time, but Oren, I know you study poverty policy. Most of Planned Parenthood's federal revenue comes just from women using their Medicaid to get various services there. With the moving of Medicaid to state block grants, put pressure on women's health services too, because it's not just unlimited based on your qualifications.
Well, I think it would vary by state. You know, one of the implications of the policy is that states are going to have to decide where they want to focus their money. Right now, we literally pay states to spend more on Medicaid. If we instead tell states, here's how much you have, you need to prioritize, you might see some states that say Planned Parenthood gets the first dollar. You might see some that say, actually, Planned Parenthood gets none of the dollars.
All right. We have not solved everything today, not quite, but a good review of the first 6 months and a little. Thank you all very much for joining us. And that's POTUS 2017 for today. We're here each week at this hour, pouring more cold, hard facts on more overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thank you for watching.